The air in London was thick with the smell of smoke and the ever-present hum of distant engines. It was 1941, and Britain had been fighting a relentless war for almost 2 years. The Blitz was still fresh in the minds of the people, with the streets of London and other major cities battered by the constant pounding of German bombers. German U-boats were attacking vital shipping routes, cutting off supplies, and Britain's rationing system had begun to show the strain. With France occupied and much of Europe under Nazi control, Britain stood almost alone in the fight against Hitler's regime. The British government, led by Winston Churchill, had already demonstrated its resilience, but as the war dragged on, it was clear that Britain needed help, and fast. On March 11, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act into law. The United States, though still officially neutral in the war, would provide critical military and economic assistance to Britain and other allied nations fighting the Axis powers. The Lend-Lease Act was revolutionary as it allowed America to send military equipment, food, and resources without requiring immediate payment. The aid was a lifeline, a desperate lifeline that Britain could not afford to turn down. As the first American ships arrived at the British ports in the spring of 1941, the sight of American cargo trucks and military vehicles unloading supplies felt like a dream come true. For the first time since the war began, the people of Britain could see a glimmer of hope, a sense that they would no longer fight alone. Winston Churchill, Britain's indomitable Prime Minister, had long urged the United States to provide this assistance. In a speech delivered in December 1940, he had famously declared, "Give us the tools, and we will finish the job." But now, as he watched the first trucks full of American aid roll into London, he knew the battle for Britain's survival had entered a new phase. On the morning of June 1941, Churchill stood outside 10 Downing Street, looking toward the horizon. The sounds of air raid sirens were still familiar, and the streets still bore the marks of bombing damage. But today, he had a moment of relief. The ships had arrived, loaded with everything from ammunition and food to new military equipment, including armored vehicles and fighters. The first of the American-built trucks trundled into the city as British citizens lined the streets, curious and hopeful. Churchill smiled slightly as he watched the procession, but his eyes betrayed a sense of cautious optimism. He had long known that America's support was the turning point for the war effort, but he had also seen how fragile this support could be. The bombs still fell daily, and the war was far from over. The aid was a start, but Britain had no illusions. This was just a beginning, not the end. As Churchill turned to head back inside, his secretary approached him with a slip of paper, a note bearing news from Roosevelt's office. The American president's promise had finally materialized. "This is it," Churchill muttered under his breath, staring at the message. His heart quickened as he realized the magnitude of the moment. For the first time since the start of the war, there was no turning back. The United States was now irrevocably tied to the British war effort, and their survival depended on this vital partnership. Meanwhile, British citizens in London, Manchester, Liverpool, and beyond had begun to hear the news that the Lend-Lease aid had arrived. In the streets, workers and families alike watched with a sense of awe as American trucks, bright and new, filled the streets. In Liverpool, an elderly man, John Holloway, stood watching the trucks unload at the docks, his face filled with disbelief. "We thought we were going to lose," he said, his voice trembling as he looked at the American trucks unloading boxes of ammunition and rations. "But now, this is our chance. They've come to help us when we needed it most." For John, like many others, the arrival of American goods was a symbol not just of military aid, but of a promise, a future. As the first shipments were unloaded, the mood in the streets of London became one of cautious hope. Citizens who had spent the past year dodging bombs and dealing with constant shortages now began to see a change. Children watched with wide eyes as the American soldiers, wearing their distinctive uniforms, began unloading crates and goods. One child, a young boy named Tommy, looked up at his mother and asked, "Mom, "What are those men bringing?" "They're bringing us the things we need to fight the war," his mother answered, her voice full of emotion, yet tinged with relief. "The Americans are helping us. We won't be alone anymore." At that moment, the sense of connection between the American and British people was palpable. It was not just about the materials and military supplies. It was about the knowledge that Britain was not alone, that America had come to the aid of a nation under siege. And for the first time in months, British civilians felt like they could breathe again. For Churchill, the arrival of the Lend-Lease shipments marked the beginning of a new phase of the war, a phase where Britain could count on its allies for support. Yet he knew that the war would not be won by supplies alone. Victory, he often said, would depend on courage, determination, and the resolve of the British people. The arrival of the Lend-Lease shipments in the spring of 1941 didn't just provide material relief. It signified a pivotal moment in Britain's war effort. The convoys of American trucks, jeeps, and weaponry that began flooding British ports were not only physical manifestations of foreign aid, but also powerful symbols of a nation's survival. As the first American-made supplies reached London, the reaction from both civilians and military leaders was one of eager anticipation mixed with uncertainty. The British public, still battered from the Blitz, now faced a bittersweet reality. Though the aid offered hope for their survival, it also exposed the fragility of Britain's position in the war. One afternoon, as a convoy of Lend-Lease trucks rolled through the streets of London, the sight was greeted with a mix of relief and wariness. Sarah Montgomery, a nurse who had spent the better part of the past year tending to the wounded in the midst of air raids, watched as the convoy passed by. The trucks, emblazoned with the American flag, were carrying medical supplies, bandages, antibiotics, and food. For Sarah, the sight of these trucks was a poignant reminder of how dire the situation had become. "I never thought we'd have to depend on others for our very survival," Sarah said softly to her colleague as the trucks rolled past. "But without this aid, we might not have lasted much longer. We're grateful, of course, but there's a certain humility in realizing just how much we've needed them." This sense of humility was shared by many British citizens. While the gratitude for the supplies was undeniable, there was also a quiet realization that Britain's survival was no longer solely in its hands. In London, as well as in the smaller towns that had been ravaged by bombings, there was a palpable awareness that the balance of power was shifting, not only because of the support from America, but because of the deepening dependency on the United States. At the Royal Air Force, a RAF base, where British pilots had been flying aging Spitfires and Hurricanes, the sight of new American fighters arriving was a revelation. Group Captain Robert White, a veteran pilot, stood by the tarmac, watching as a new squadron of P-51 Mustangs was being readied for their first sortie. He knew the Mustang was one of the most advanced planes in the world, and for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of optimism. "This is a game changer," White said to his squadron, the excitement in his voice unmistakable. "The Americans have given us the tools to finish the job." However, White's optimism was tempered by the reality of the situation. He knew that these planes were just the first step in Britain's long road to recovery. Lend-Lease aid was essential, but it couldn't replace the soldiers, the pilots, the endurance that Britain had already shown in the fight. The RAF's continued success depended not just on the new American equipment, but also on the spirit of the British pilots, who had already withstood months of near-constant combat. Meanwhile, Churchill, always deeply involved in the strategic decisions of the war, found himself torn. As he watched the aid flow into Britain, he knew the importance of American support, but he also realized the long-term implications. He had always stressed Britain's independence, but the Lend-Lease Act made it clear that the war effort would no longer be solely Britain's burden to bear. One afternoon, in a conversation with his trusted aide, General Hastings, LRL, Churchill reflected on the weight of the aid. The two were standing in Churchill's study, overlooking the gardens of 10 Downing Street, when Churchill spoke with a rare vulnerability. "We owe them everything, Churchill said quietly, staring out the window. "But this dependence, I wonder, when the war is over, what will become of us? Will we be able to stand on our own again?" General LRL placed a hand on Churchill's shoulder, offering quiet reassurance. "The fight is far from over, sir. But we will be stronger for this partnership. When the dust settles, we'll rebuild Britain, together with the United States by our side." Churchill nodded, but his face remained tense. He had been the symbol of British defiance, the leader who promised that Britain would never surrender. But in his heart, he understood that the future of Britain depended on more than just bravery. It now depended on the United States' commitment to the cause. Across the country, ordinary citizens were experiencing their own forms of gratitude mixed with unease. In the towns and cities hardest hit by the bombings, people looked to the sky every night, watching for the Luftwaffe, but also watching for the American supplies that had become part of their daily lives. For many, the arrival of Lend-Lease aid was a visible reminder of the partnership between the two nations. But it was also a reminder of how much Britain had lost. Emily Thompson, a mother living in Manchester, shared her thoughts as she stood in line at the local food distribution center to receive her weekly ration of American-supplied goods. "I'm grateful," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "but I can't help but feel like we're losing something important. We shouldn't need to rely on someone else, should we?" Her words echoed the quiet concern that had taken root in many hearts across Britain. Lend-Lease was vital for survival, but it came with the knowledge that Britain's independence was being reshaped by its relationship with the United States. While American generosity had given Britain a fighting chance, it also left many wondering about the future. When the war was over, what would Britain's place be in the world? Would they be able to regain the independence they had once enjoyed? By late 1941, as Lend-Lease shipments began arriving in larger quantities, the relief for Britain was palpable. No longer solely relying on strained local resources, the nation could finally begin to rebuild its shattered infrastructure, replenish its military stocks, and address some of the most pressing civilian needs caused by the Blitz and the German blockade. In London, the atmosphere was charged with a mixture of eager anticipation and gratitude. The first American ships had arrived at the docks carrying a variety of goods, including trucks, ammunition, aircraft parts, and medicines. For British citizens, especially those working in factories and on the front lines, this aid marked a vital lifeline to keep Britain's defenses operational. As General Hastings, LRL, stood at an RAF base in South London, he watched as American-built aircraft, especially the powerful P-51 Mustang fighter planes, were prepared for deployment. "These planes," General LRL said, his voice filled with awe, "are going to change the course of this war. The Americans have given us the ability to not only defend our skies, but also to strike back at the enemy with more precision." Meanwhile, Churchill was deeply engaged in the strategic consequences of the Lend-Lease shipments. He knew that while Britain's ability to continue the fight had been greatly bolstered, it wasn't just about military support. The American food shipments, including canned goods, wheat, cornmeal, and dried fruits, were essential in sustaining a population struggling with constant rationing. Churchill had been faced with decisions of survival for his people, and now he had the tangible means to do so. He had always spoken of British resilience, but now, with American help, that resilience could be sustained. "I received a letter from Roosevelt today," Churchill remarked in a meeting with his war cabinet. "The aid is flooding in, and with it, our people can continue to endure. We will not be defeated, not by bombs, not by hunger. This is the aid that ensures our survival." Churchill's statement was both a relief and a warning. The British public, still deeply committed to their own national pride, now understood the reality this support was essential. But it was also a partnership, and Churchill's leadership was pivotal in maintaining it. As trucks full of Lend-Lease supplies rolled through the streets of London, ordinary citizens felt the weight of the change. Food prices began to stabilize, and the weekly ration books began to look a little less sparse. The first American jeeps and military vehicles delivered to British military bases were met with cheers from soldiers. These vehicles were not just practical, they were the tools of survival, enabling the British Army to quickly reposition forces and keep up with the demands of the war. In Liverpool, as the first American shipments arrived at the docks, long lines of workers began unloading crates marked with the unmistakable U.S. insignia. It wasn't just the military supplies that excited them, but the promise of replenished resources that would make Britain's efforts sustainable. One worker, George Miller, watched as trucks unloaded piles of munitions and ammunition, his face alight with hope. "Look at this," George exclaimed, pointing at the convoy of military trucks. "That's the kind of thing we needed. Tanks, artillery, trucks. This is what will win the war." American-made goods were not limited to military support. Among the supplies that arrived were civilian essentials such as new radios, telecommunications equipment, and construction materials, all of which helped restore Britain's fractured civilian life. The radio systems provided were essential for keeping communication lines open, especially with air raids becoming more frequent. Food supplies came in abundance, and the canned goods sent from the United States were a welcome sight in homes across the country. Families, though still rationed, were finally receiving much-needed varieties of food they hadn't seen in years. For the first time, the constant dread of starvation seemed to subside, if only for a moment. In a community center in London, where the newly arrived American food supplies were being distributed, Sarah Montgomery, the nurse from earlier, witnessed the relief in the faces of her fellow Londoners. She overheard a conversation between two women standing in line for their ration cards. "I never thought I'd see fresh oranges again," one of the women remarked, holding up a small crate of fruit. "After all this time, America has brought us the food we've been missing. If this isn't a sign that we're going to make it through, I don't know what is." Sarah smiled at the sight of the crates, filled with canned milk, cheese, and butter, and thought about her patients in the hospitals. The Lend-Lease aid wasn't just military. It was life-saving for the population that had been living under the constant strain of war. She knew that without this aid, Britain's resilience would have been stretched too thin. The war was over, but Britain had yet to fully reckon with the cost of its survival. In the spring of 1945, as the final rays of victory over Nazi Germany began to shine down on London, the reality of Britain's dependence on America's Lend-Lease aid started to sink in. The joy of victory was tempered by the awareness that Britain's post-war future would look very different from what many had envisioned just a few years ago. In the aftermath of the war, the British economy was in shambles, and the Lend-Lease aid that had kept Britain afloat for the past 4 years was no longer coming in at the same scale. The American trucks, jeeps, and supplies that had once been a common sight on British streets were now fewer, their absence a subtle yet significant reminder of just how reliant Britain had become on the United States during the war. For Mary Jackson, a mother of 3 from Manchester, the end of the war brought mixed emotions. Throughout the war, she had seen American aid trucks unload flour, canned goods, and military trucks full of provisions to feed her family and support the British war effort. But now, as rations returned to their pre-war levels, and with the American trucks less frequent, Mary couldn't help but feel a certain unease. "I remember the first time I saw those American trucks rolling into the docks," she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "It felt like a blessing. We could finally have fresh vegetables, canned meat, things we hadn't seen in years. But now that the war's over, I wonder what we'll do without them. We can't rely on them forever." Her concern was not just about the immediate survival, but about Britain's future role in the world. She had seen the value of the Lend-Lease program, but she couldn't help but feel that Britain was losing its independence, a dependency that wasn't just on food, but also on military supplies and industrial goods. At a local factory in Birmingham, where British workers had spent much of the war manufacturing tanks and aeroplanes with the help of American parts and tools, a sense of post-war uncertainty settled in. Tom Harris, a machinist who had worked alongside American soldiers to assemble military vehicles, recalled the efficiency of the new supplies and how much they had improved Britain's ability to compete in the war. "Before the Americans came, we were struggling with outdated machinery and parts," he said. "But once those Lend-Lease shipments started arriving, everything changed. We were building better planes, better tanks, faster, and more efficiently. But now, the supplies have stopped, and we've got to stand on our own. Can we really do that? Or have we become too reliant on what they've given us?" Tom's question reflected a bigger issue that was on many minds. Could Britain continue to compete on the world stage once Lend-Lease ended? As British industry began to turn its focus to rebuilding after the war, many workers found themselves questioning the future of their nation's independence. The sense of self-reliance that Britain had once prided itself on felt like a distant memory. At the same time, Churchill, ever the leader, had his own reflections on the post-war future. Standing at his desk in 10 Downing Street, he peered over a pile of reports detailing the growing costs of reconstruction and the economic dependence on the United States. He'd seen the hope and gratitude the American aid had inspired, but he also knew that the future of Britain could not be built on American support alone. "We owe them everything," Churchill said quietly to his advisors one evening, looking out over the smog-filled London skyline. "But once this war ends, we must stand on our own. Britain has been a great nation, and we must rebuild it, without relying on others. This special relationship with the Americans will serve us well, but it cannot define us." But even Churchill, whose faith in British resilience was unshakable, had doubts. The reality was that, after years of war, Britain's post-war plans were increasingly tied to the United States. America's economic strength and its dominance on the global stage meant that Britain would have to negotiate a new role for itself in a rapidly changing world. As Britain prepared for a post-war future, ordinary citizens like Mary and Tom couldn't help but wonder what that future would look like. Would they remain a world power in their own right, or would they forever be second to the United States in the coming global order? The special relationship between the two nations, forged during the war, was now a double-edged sword, an alliance that had sustained Britain through its darkest hours, but also a reminder that Britain's future would be increasingly tied to its transatlantic ally. As the sun set on May 8, 1945, marking the official end of the war in Europe, the British public celebrated. But as they poured into the streets of London, cheering and waving their flags, there was a sense that the victory was only part of the story. The future, while bright with the hope of peace, was filled with uncertainty about Britain's place in the world.